There's a truth about emotional pain that Daniel Goleman spent decades uncovering, a truth that most people never discover until they've been broken too many times. The suffering we experience from other people's words, from rejection, from disappointment, isn't actually caused by what happens to us. It's caused by something far more subtle, something happening inside our own minds, in the space between what occurs and how we respond to it. Most of us go through life believing that our pain is inevitable, that when someone hurts us, we have no choice but to hurt. We think that emotional wounds are like physical ones, that they happen to us from the outside, and all we can do is endure them. But what Goleman's research revealed, what neuroscience has confirmed, is that we possess a far greater power than we realize. We have the capacity to build an inner fortress so strong that nothing external can truly penetrate it, not because we become cold or disconnected, but because we understand how pain actually works. This isn't about becoming invulnerable or shutting down emotionally. It's about developing what Goleman calls emotional intelligence at its highest level, the ability to recognize what's happening in our internal landscape before it hijacks our peace. And when we master this awareness, when we learn to observe our emotional reactions rather than being consumed by them, we discover something remarkable. The world doesn't change, but our relationship to it transforms completely. What follows are 8 psychological secrets drawn from Goleman's work and from decades of research into the human mind that have the power to fundamentally alter how external events affect your inner world. These aren't techniques to memorize or steps to follow. They're shifts in understanding, changes in perspective that once seen cannot be unseen. And each one brings you closer to a state that most people believe is impossible, genuine emotional freedom. The first secret is perhaps the most counterintuitive, and it begins with understanding that what hurts us is never the event itself, but always the story we tell about it. When someone criticizes us, when we face rejection, when we experience loss, there's a moment, a fraction of a second, where the event is simply neutral information entering our awareness. A sound wave reaches our ears, words register in our consciousness, a situation unfolds. And in that pristine moment before interpretation, there is no suffering, but our minds don't leave information neutral. Within milliseconds, what Goleman calls the amygdala, that ancient alarm system in our brain, begins its work. It scans for threat, it compares to past wounds, it projects forward into imagined futures, and, most importantly, it creates meaning. The criticism becomes evidence that we're not good enough. The rejection becomes proof that we're unlovable. The loss becomes confirmation that life is unfair. And it's this meaning, this interpretation, this story we construct that generates the emotional pain we feel. Consider how the same event can devastate one person while barely affecting another. 2 people receive identical feedback at work. One spirals into self-doubt, questioning their worth, unable to sleep for days. The other sees it as useful information, adjusts their approach, and moves on within minutes. The external event was identical, but the internal interpretation, the story each person told themselves about what it meant, created completely different emotional realities. This is what Goleman means when he talks about emotional intelligence. It's not about controlling what happens, but about recognizing that we have agency over how we interpret what happens. The power in this realization is immense. If our pain comes from interpretation rather than events, then changing our interpretation changes our pain. This doesn't mean denying reality or pretending things don't hurt. It means recognizing that there are multiple valid ways to interpret any situation, and some interpretations serve our well-being while others destroy it. When someone speaks harshly to us, we can choose to interpret it as a reflection of their inner turmoil rather than evidence of our inadequacy. When we face setback, we can choose to see it as redirection rather than rejection. And in making these choices consciously, we reclaim power we didn't know we had. The second secret builds on the first. and reveals why most of us remain trapped in painful interpretations. We believe our emotions are telling us the truth. When we feel hurt, we assume someone has hurt us. When we feel rejected, we're certain we've been rejected. When we feel inadequate, we believe we are inadequate. Our emotions feel like direct reports from reality, and so we trust them completely. But what Goleman's work illuminates is that emotions are not truth detectors. They're pattern recognition systems, and they're often recognizing patterns from our past, rather than responding accurately to our present. The brain is designed for survival, not for happiness. Its primary job is to keep us safe, and it does this by learning from painful experiences and trying to prevent their repetition. So when something happens that resembles a past wound, even slightly, the amygdala triggers an emotional response based on that old experience. This is what Goleman calls emotional hijacking, when a response from the past overtakes our present moment awareness. A casual comment from a colleague triggers the shame we felt from a critical parent. A partner's distraction reminds us of abandonment we experienced as children. A friend's success activates feelings of inadequacy we've carried for years. And because these emotions feel so real, so immediate, so true, we believe they're responding to what's actually happening now. We don't realize we're experiencing an echo from the past. The colleague isn't our critical parent. The distracted partner isn't abandoning us. The friend's success isn't evidence of our failure, but the emotional memory doesn't know that. It only knows that something in the present resembles something in the past, and it floods our system with the same feelings we had then. Understanding this changes everything. When we feel hurt, instead of immediately believing that we've been hurt, we can pause and ask, is this actually about now, or am I responding to something from my history? Is this person actually attacking me, or have their words triggered an old wound that's been waiting for an excuse to bleed again? This questioning doesn't invalidate our feelings. It contextualizes them. It gives us space between the trigger and our response. And in that space, we find freedom. Goleman discovered through his research that people with high emotional intelligence don't feel less pain. They simply develop the capacity to observe their pain without being controlled by it. They recognize that an emotion is a signal, not a command. It's information about their inner state, but it's not necessarily accurate information about external reality. And this recognition, this ability to hold emotions lightly while examining them carefully, becomes a form of protection that nothing external can penetrate. The third secret reveals something most people never consider. We are not being hurt by others, we're being hurt by our expectations. Every disappointment, every betrayal, every moment of feeling let down stems from the gap between what we expected and what actually occurred. And these expectations, often invisible even to ourselves, create the conditions for our own suffering. We expect people to treat us the way we treat them. We expect fairness in a universe that makes no such promise. We expect others to value what we value, to care about what we care about, to see us the way we see ourselves. And when reality inevitably diverges from these expectations, we experience it as a wound. But the wound isn't caused by reality. It's caused by our insistence that reality should be different than it is. Goleman's work on emotional intelligence emphasizes the importance of what he calls realistic optimism, the ability to see situations clearly without either pessimism or unrealistic hope. When we carry hidden expectations, we're setting ourselves up for pain because we're relating to an imagined version of reality rather than reality itself. We're hurt when a friend doesn't call because we expected them to. We're devastated when a project fails because we expected success. We're crushed when someone doesn't reciprocate our feelings because we expected them to feel what we feel. But here's what shifts everything. Expectations are something we create, which means they're something we can examine, adjust, and sometimes release. this doesn't mean becoming cynical or expecting nothing. It means bringing our expectations into conscious awareness so we can evaluate whether they're reasonable, whether they're serving us, whether they're aligned with reality. When we expect others to read our minds, we set ourselves up for disappointment. When we expect perfection from ourselves, we guarantee suffering. When we expect life to conform to our preferences, we live in constant resistance to what is. The practice here is simple, but profound. Before we feel hurt by what someone did or didn't do, we can ask, what did I expect? Was that expectation communicated? Was it reasonable, given the context? And most importantly, am I willing to suffer for holding on to an expectation that reality isn't meeting? Sometimes we discover that our expectations are valid and need to be communicated. Other times we realize we've been carrying expectations that have no basis in the actual relationship or situation. And in both cases, bringing expectations into consciousness gives us power. We stop being victims of our own unexamined assumptions. This is part of what Goleman means by self-awareness, the foundation of emotional intelligence. We can't manage what we can't see, and most of our expectations operate below the level of conscious awareness. They're inherited from our families, absorbed from our culture, constructed from our wounds. But when we illuminate them, when we bring them into the light of consciousness, we can choose. We can decide which expectations to keep and which to release, which disappointments to accept and which to challenge. And in that choosing, we build a resilience that external circumstances cannot touch. The fourth secret addresses something even more fundamental. Most of the pain we experience isn't happening to us in the present moment at all. It's happening in our minds through a process of mental repetition. Someone says something hurtful, and the moment passes in seconds, but we replay it for hours, days, sometimes years. We tell the story to ourselves and others. We imagine what we should have said. We rehearse future confrontations. We build elaborate narratives about what it means. And with each repetition, we wound ourselves again, far more deeply than the original event ever could. Goleman's research into mindfulness and present moment awareness reveals something crucial. The mind, when left to its own devices, becomes a machine for generating suffering. It fixates on past wounds and future fears, rarely resting in the only moment where we actually have power, which is now. And this tendency to ruminate, to cycle through painful thoughts repeatedly, is one of the primary ways we keep ourselves trapped in emotional pain long after the triggering event has ended. Think about how many times you've replayed a difficult conversation. The conversation itself lasted perhaps 10 minutes, but you've revisited it mentally for hours, each time feeling the same anger, hurt, or shame. The other person moved on instantly, but you're still carrying the weight of those moments, not because they're happening, but because you keep resurrecting them in your awareness. You're not being hurt by what occurred. You're being hurt by your relationship to what occurred, by your inability to let the moment pass. This isn't about suppressing or denying difficult experiences. It's about recognizing that there's a difference between processing pain and rehearsing it. Processing means feeling the emotion fully, understanding what it's teaching us, and then letting it move through us. Rehearsing means playing the same scene over and over, keeping the wound fresh, never allowing it to heal. And most of us, without realizing it, have become experts at rehearsal. Before we continue, take a moment to tell us in the comments what city you're watching this from. The practice that emerges from this understanding is what Goleman calls emotional self-regulation. It's the capacity to notice when our minds are spiraling into repetitive, painful thoughts and gently redirect our attention. Not by force, not by trying to think positive thoughts, but by choosing to return to present moment awareness. When we catch ourselves replaying a hurtful conversation, we can acknowledge the thought without feeding it. We can observe, I'm ruminating again, and then we can make a choice. We can continue the rumination, or we can bring our attention back to what's actually happening right now in this moment. What's remarkable is that when we do this consistently, we discover something liberating. Most of the time, right now, nothing is actually wrong. The hurt is in the memory or the imagination, not in the present. And by training ourselves to return to now, we stop being prisoners of our own mental loops. The event that hurt us becomes just one moment in time rather than a story we carry forever. And this, perhaps more than anything else, is what allows us to move through life without accumulating wounds, without building walls, without becoming hardened by our experiences. The fifth secret illuminates why some people seem immune to criticism, while others crumble at the slightest negative feedback. It has everything to do with where they locate their sense of worth. When our value is tied to external validation, to what others think of us, to how we're perceived or judged, we're constantly vulnerable. Every opinion becomes a potential threat. Every criticism feels like an attack on our very being. But when we internalize our worth, when we understand that our value isn't determined by external opinion but by something more fundamental, we become remarkably difficult to wound. Goleman's work on self-awareness and self-confidence reveals that people with genuine emotional security aren't deluded about their flaws or defensive about criticism. They simply don't equate feedback about their behavior with judgments about their worth. They can hear that they made a mistake without believing they are a mistake. They can accept that someone dislikes them without concluding they're unlikable. This isn't arrogance or denial. It's a clear-eyed understanding of a crucial distinction. What we do is not who we are. Most of us learned the opposite. We learned that our worth was conditional, earned through achievement, maintained through approval. We internalized the message that we're valuable when we succeed, lovable when we please others, worthy when we meet expectations. And this conditioning created a fundamental vulnerability. It placed our sense of self on unstable ground, dependent on factors beyond our control. When our worth depends on others' opinions, we live in constant anxiety because those opinions can change in an instant. But here's what shifts when we truly understand this. Opinions, including our own, are not facts. They're perspectives shaped by countless variables that have nothing to do with our intrinsic value. When someone criticizes us, they're offering information filtered through their own wounds, preferences, and limited perspective. They're telling us something about how our actions intersected with their expectations. But they're not revealing an objective truth about our worth as human beings. This realization doesn't mean we dismiss all feedback or stop caring what others think. It means we evaluate feedback through the lens of usefulness rather than the lens of worth. We can ask, is this criticism helping me grow? Is it pointing to something I genuinely want to change? Does it come from someone whose perspective I value? And we can consider these questions without spiraling into self-doubt, without taking the criticism as evidence that we're fundamentally flawed because we understand that our worth exists independent of any single person's opinion. Goleman emphasizes that this internal locus of worth is developed, not innate. It comes from consistent practice of self-compassion, from learning to speak to ourselves the way we'd speak to someone we love. When we make mistakes, instead of attacking ourselves, we can acknowledge the error with kindness. When we fall short of expectations, instead of concluding we're inadequate, we can recognize that imperfection is the human condition. And gradually, through thousands of small moments of choosing self-acceptance over self-judgment, we build a foundation that external circumstances cannot shake. The sixth secret addresses something we rarely examine: the power dynamics we unconsciously create in our relationships. When we give others the authority to determine our emotional state, when we make our peace contingent on their behavior, we place ourselves in a position of perpetual vulnerability. And most of us do this without realizing it, through subtle patterns of emotional dependence that masquerade as love, care, or connection. We wait for someone to text back, and our mood depends entirely on their response time. We need validation for our choices and feel anxious without it. We take responsibility for others' emotions and feel devastated when they're upset, even if we've done nothing wrong. These patterns, while common, represent a fundamental misunderstanding of where emotional power actually resides. We've externalized our internal authority. We've handed others the remote control to our inner experience. Goleman's concept of emotional independence, which he distinguishes clearly from isolation, speaks to this directly. Emotionally independent people maintain clear boundaries between their internal state and others' behavior. They can care deeply about someone without making that person responsible for their happiness. They can be affected by others' actions without being controlled by them. They recognize that while we're all interconnected, each person ultimately has sovereignty over their own emotional world. This doesn't mean becoming cold or detached. It means understanding that true intimacy requires two whole people choosing connection, not two halves, desperately trying to complete each other. When we stop looking to others to fill our internal voids, to soothe our anxieties, to confirm our worth, we actually become more capable of genuine relationship. We're no longer relating from neediness, but from abundance. We're not trying to get something from the other person. We're choosing to share what we already have. The practice here involves noticing when we've handed our power away. When we find ourselves thinking, "They made me feel this way," or "I can't be happy unless they change," or "My well-being depends on their approval," we're identifying moments where we've externalized our emotional authority. And in those moments, we have a choice. We can reclaim that authority. We can ask, what do I need to feel stable regardless of what they do? How can I meet my own emotional needs instead of demanding someone else meet them? What would change if I stopped waiting for external circumstances to grant me permission to feel okay? This reclaiming isn't selfish or disconnected. It's actually the foundation of healthy relationship, because when we're emotionally whole, we stop manipulating others to maintain our stability. We stop punishing them for failing to read our minds or meet our unspoken needs. We stop creating unconscious power dynamics where they're responsible for our feelings. And paradoxically, when we stop needing others to make us feel okay, our relationships often deepen. People feel safer around us because we're not placing invisible burdens on them. Connection becomes choice rather than compulsion. The seventh secret reveals something that changes how we experience every difficult interaction. Most of the time, other people's behavior has absolutely nothing to do with us. When someone is rude, distant, critical, or hurtful, we instinctively personalize it. We assume their behavior is a response to who we are, what we said, what we represent. But what Goleman's research into empathy and emotional contagion shows is that people are almost always responding to their own internal state, their own triggers, their own unresolved wounds. And we just happen to be the convenient target. Think about your own experience. When you've snapped at someone, was it really about them? Or were you already stressed, tired, overwhelmed? When you've been cold or distant, was it truly a reflection of how you felt about that person? Or were you dealing with your own pain and simply had nothing left to give? Most of the time, our behavior reflects our internal weather, not the inherent value or behavior of the person we're interacting with. And the same is true for everyone else. But we forget this in the moment. When someone criticizes us, we don't think they must be having a difficult day. We think, what did I do wrong? When someone doesn't respond to our message, we don't consider that they might be overwhelmed. We assume they don't care. When someone is short with us, we take it as evidence of how they feel about us, rather than recognizing it might be about the argument they had earlier, the stress they're carrying, the exhaustion they can't shake. This tendency to personalize everything is so automatic, so deeply ingrained, that we don't even notice we're doing it. But it's one of the primary sources of unnecessary suffering. We wound ourselves by taking responsibility for other people's emotional states. by interpreting their behavior through the lens of our own insecurities, rather than recognizing that most of the time, their behavior is about them. Goleman calls this lack of perspective-taking a deficit in empathy, not in the sense of not caring about others, but in the sense of not being able to see past our own viewpoint. When we develop genuine empathy, we recognize that everyone is fighting battles we know nothing about. Everyone is carrying wounds that get triggered in ways they don't fully understand. Everyone is doing the best they can with the emotional resources they currently have access to. And when we remember this, when we hold this awareness, other people's behavior loses its power to devastate us. This doesn't mean excusing genuinely harmful behavior or staying in toxic relationships. It means not taking things personally when personalization isn't warranted. It means maintaining enough psychological distance to ask, is this about me or is this about them? And more often than not, when we ask that question honestly, we discover it's about them. Their criticism reflects their standards and insecurities, not objective truth about us. Their rejection reflects their fears and capacity, not our inherent unworthiness. Their coldness reflects their disconnection from themselves, not evidence that we're unlovable. Share this with someone who needs to hear these words today. When we stop personalizing other people's behavior, we stop being wounded by it. We can observe it with compassion, we can set boundaries if needed, we can even choose to distance ourselves from people who are consistently hurtful. But we do all of this from a place of clarity rather than from a place of woundedness. We recognize that their behavior is information about them, and we use that information wisely without letting it define us. The eighth and final secret ties everything together and points toward something even more fundamental. Nothing can truly hurt us when we stop resisting what is. Most of our suffering doesn't come from painful events themselves, but from our resistance to those events, our insistence that they shouldn't be happening, our desperate attempts to make reality different than it is. And this resistance, this mental fighting against what's already occurred, is where the deepest pain lives. Goleman's integration of mindfulness into emotional intelligence leads directly to this understanding. When something painful happens and we resist it, when we think, this shouldn't be happening, or why is this happening to me, or this isn't fair, we're adding a layer of suffering on top of the original pain. The event itself might cause discomfort, but the resistance to the event causes anguish. We're not just experiencing what is, we're fighting with what is, and that fight is exhausting and ultimately futile. Consider how differently we experience unavoidable pain versus pain we believe shouldn't be happening. If we stub our toe, we feel physical pain, but we don't usually layer existential suffering on top of it. We don't lie awake wondering why the universe allowed us to stub our toe, what it means about our worth, whether we deserved it. We simply acknowledge that it hurts, we tend to it, and we move on. But when someone hurts our feelings, when we experience rejection or failure, we do all of that. We resist, we ruminate, we make it mean something about our lives and our worth. And that resistance multiplies the original pain 1,000-fold. Acceptance, in the way Goleman and mindfulness teachers use the term, doesn't mean resignation or approval. It doesn't mean we like what's happening, or that we stop working to improve situations. It means we acknowledge what is actually true in this moment without adding layers of mental resistance. It means we stop arguing with reality. When someone treats us badly, acceptance means acknowledging, this person treated me badly, not, this person treated me badly and that means I'm worthless and life is unfair and I'll never be happy. Just the simple truth of what occurred. This kind of acceptance creates space between the event and our interpretation of it, space between what happened and what it means, space between the pain and the suffering we add to the pain. And in that space, we find something remarkable. We have choices we couldn't see when we were caught in resistance. We can choose how to respond. We can choose what meaning to make. We can choose whether to let this event define us or whether to let it simply be something that happened. Goleman's research shows that people who develop this capacity for acceptance without resistance are the ones who move through life's difficulties with the least lasting damage. They feel pain, yes. They experience disappointment and loss. But they don't magnify these experiences through resistance. They don't turn temporary pain into permanent suffering. They meet each moment as it is. They feel what they feel, and then they let it pass, the way weather passes through the sky. This is the ultimate secret, the foundation beneath all the others. When we stop fighting with reality, when we accept what is without needing it to be different, we discover that nothing external can truly disturb our peace. Not because painful things stop happening, they never will, but because we're no longer at war with our own experience. We're no longer demanding that life conform to our preferences as a condition for our okayness. We've found something more stable, more real, more available than any external circumstance could provide. And this is what Goleman was pointing toward all along with his research into emotional intelligence. It's not about manipulating our emotions or pretending we don't feel what we feel. It's about developing such a deep understanding of how our inner world works that we're no longer unconsciously creating our own suffering. It's about recognizing that between what happens to us and how we experience it, there's a vast landscape of choice, awareness, and possibility. We began by exploring the truth that our pain comes from interpretation, not events. And now, having journeyed through these 8 secrets, that truth feels less like information and more like a doorway. Because when we understand that suffering is constructed in our own minds through the stories we tell, the expectations we hold, the resistance we carry, we also understand that we can deconstruct it. Not instantly, not perfectly, but gradually, through conscious practice and growing awareness. These secrets aren't meant to make you invulnerable or emotionless. They're meant to restore you to your natural state of resilience, to remind you of a capacity you've always possessed, but perhaps forgot. The capacity to be touched by life without being broken by it, to feel deeply without being destroyed, to remain open without being helpless. This is what Goleman means when he talks about emotional intelligence at its highest expression, the ability to engage fully with life's challenges while maintaining an unshakable core of peace. The practice isn't to implement all of these secrets at once or to perfect any single one. The practice is simply to notice, moment by moment, when we're creating unnecessary suffering through unconscious patterns of interpretation, expectation, rumination, externalized worth, given away power, personalization, or resistance. And in that noticing, in that moment of awareness, we have a choice. We can continue the pattern, or we can choose differently. Each time we catch ourselves spiraling into a painful story and pause to ask if that story is true, we build the neural pathways of emotional freedom. Each time we release an unreasonable expectation, we lighten our burden. Each time we return from rumination to present moment awareness, we practice the art of letting go. Each time we affirm our worth independent of external validation, we strengthen our foundation. Each time we reclaim power we've handed away, we step into sovereignty. Each time we refuse to personalize someone else's behavior, we protect our peace. Each time we accept what is without resistance, we touch the deepest freedom available to human consciousness. This journey of emotional intelligence, as Goleman has shown through decades of research, isn't about reaching some final destination where nothing ever hurts. It's about transforming our relationship to hurt itself, understanding it so deeply that we no longer fear it, no longer run from it, no longer let it define us. Pain becomes simply one weather pattern among many, something we can acknowledge and move through rather than something that moves through us, leaving devastation in its wake. And in this transformation, we discover something that no external circumstance can provide or take away, the peace that comes from knowing ourselves so completely that nothing outside can truly shake us, not because we've built walls or shut down our hearts, but because we've developed the wisdom to hold our hearts gently while letting the world be exactly as it is. This is the invitation that these 8 secrets extend. Not to a life without pain that's neither possible nor desirable, but to a life where pain no longer has the power to steal your peace, where you can be fully human and fully present without being at the mercy of every shifting circumstance, where nothing, truly nothing, can hurt you again because you've learned the most important truth of all. You were never as fragile as you believed. You've always been stronger, wiser, more resilient than any challenge you'll ever face. And that strength, that wisdom, that resilience has simply been waiting for you to recognize it and claim it as your own.